on the part of the doorkeeper, who is certainly a cruel person. There's a, why the heck can't we get access to the law? Actually, this shows up a lot in Kafka's work, there's a whole negative sense attached to the law itself. The law is portrayed as something to which people don't have access. There's no way for the man from the country to get access to the law. But despite that, it's made to seem his fault at the end, right? This door was made only for you. You should have shown more initiative in getting to it. I'm now going to shut it. So it's certainly possible to interpret this negatively. But at the same time, there's something very positive going on. Because the door was made only for this one person. This one character had the whole of the law created for specifically him. Even though he wasn't able to access it, and whether that's because it was inaccessible or whether he just didn't find the right way to get to it, maybe he should have just walked through the gate despite the doorkeeper, maybe he didn't bribe the doorkeeper the right way, maybe there's another gate, I don't know. But despite his inability to get to it, there's still a sense that the law was created for him. There's still something small and important that's positive. And that actually, I think, comes through the language of the story towards the end, some radiance that streams from the door. As he's about to die, as the story gets to its sort of worst point, we suddenly get more personal. Suddenly the man from the country is interesting. Suddenly all of his experiences come together as one for one question. And so it's very hard to argue that this story is somehow uplifting. But I would like to suggest that it's really not depressing. That one can read this story and actually take some joy in it. Kafka certainly didn't think so. I find it only fair to point out that Kafka certainly disagrees with this interpretation and any other that I'm about to advance. Kafka constantly thought that his own work was deeply pessimistic. There's a famous story about Kafka that when he was reading one of his other stories, The Penal Colony, aloud to some friends, he started laughing hysterically partway through and couldn't finish. This is a story that includes a death machine where a person is placed on a bed and giant needles come down and stab at their back, inscribing in massively complicated calligraphy whatever commandment they have broken. They are killed over a period of 12 hours. It's one of the most horrifying descriptions of a method of murder I've ever seen in literature. Kafka, when he read this to his friends, laughed hysterically. Kafka's not a happy guy. But his stories have this attribute of being challenging. We're challenged by before the law. It's not a happy story. It doesn't automatically make us pleased. But it also doesn't seem necessarily depressing. And so I'm actually going to wind up arguing that we ought to read these stories in a positive light instead of in a negative. Of course, if I'm going to do that, I should probably give some lip service to Kafka, right? I should probably make the case that his stories are negative. So, there's a couple distinct ways in which the stories are negative. One, a lot of them are unpleasant to read. In fact, the more famous the story is, the more unpleasant it is to read. The Metamorphosis, which I think is the most famous story, is deeply unpleasant to read. I dislike that story intensely. The Trial is only slightly better. The Castle is worse. I've never managed to finish the Castle, even though I've tried repeatedly. The story in the Penal Colony, I enjoy reading it, but it's not a particularly pleasant experience. A Hunger Artist is one of the most torturing stories I've ever read. Report to an Academy, which Hasty mentioned, is, I mean, you can read it, and it's kind of funny, but it's not fun to read. It has a sort of a very vicious gallows humor. That's not quite analytical enough to mount some sort of serious objection, because I think a lot of Kafka's other stories are very fun to read. I think the ones that I read aloud to you guys were not actually physically painful, and I actually find those stories and several others quite beautiful. There's a more serious reason for finding Kafka negative, and it's the things he describes basically fall into one category. Shit happens and nobody cares. One of the unifying threads of his work is that people are placed in very bad, very alienating circumstances, and nothing about this is recognized as unjust. Nothing about what happens to people is recognized as somehow not their fault or not bad. Or even as bad. There are oftentimes that bad things seem to happen to somebody, and that person themselves doesn't really recognize that they have been the victim of bad fortune. In Metamorphosis, the main character's first thoughts upon waking up and realizing he's a giant insect are, oh shit, I'm not going to be able to go into the office on time. There's something very depressing about this. Kafka's characters often strike us as either sociopaths, in that they just don't care what happens to other people or even themselves, or they strike us as real human beings placed in objectively horrifying situations that we can't possibly find pleasant. situations where there's nothing to gain, that are just horrifying. And I think that's why Kafka is often unpleasant to read. He's such a good writer that we're unable to dismiss these situations, even when they involve someone turning into a bug, as completely unrealistic, or more exactly, as completely unsympathetic. We still feel, to some degree, for what's going on. But what's going on is so horrifying, so frequently, that there's this view that any possible interpretation of Kafka has to be bad. Anything that doesn't ignore these most horrifying moments that is forced to accept them. There's no way to turn these moments into anything but horror. That's basically the foundation for the negative view of Kafka. And there are certainly stories where it holds true. I don't see a way to argue that the Metamorphosis is somehow a positive story. The Metamorphosis basically describes slow dehumanization and death. That is all that happens. I don't see a way to get any sort of joy out of reading that story. But I do see a way to get joy out of reading other of Kafka's stories. I do see a way to interpret Before the Law, not necessarily as positive, but as still reaffirming some level of meaning that we have as people. I'm going to get to that. I'm actually going to specifically talk about Before the Law. I don't have much time. I've already been talking for about half an hour. So I am forced to only focus on a small facet of Kafka's work. Right? I can't possibly discuss all of Kafka. There are two major themes that sort of show up that present themselves as fairly good choices for me. Law and work. Law shows up, in Before the Law and the trial, very explicitly. There's also a great story, The Problem with Our Laws. There's another one, The Advocates. There's another one, Bucephalus. That was pretty fun. The warhorse Bucephalus becomes a lawyer. It's a pretty awesome story. You should all read it. It's good. But law is one of the very few threads that spans through almost all of Kafka's works. And even when it's not explicitly mentioned, arguably it's there implicitly. So law is one of the huge ones. Then the other one is work. And I mean that in the sense of a day-to-day job. Not necessarily work in the sense of like the deeds you accomplish. In fact, it's much less based on things you actually accomplish than it is the futile process of pretending you're accomplishing something. Almost all of Kafka's characters who have a job at all, that's described, have a job as a clerk of some sort, doing needless busy work, pushing papers around. One of the very few people who actually doesn't quite share this job description is Joseph K., the main character in the trial. He is a high-ranking clerk who makes important decisions, if affecting other people's ability to push around meaningless scraps of paper. Still not very positive. Work is the other huge thread that shows up in almost all of Kafka's stories. There's a few others. I'm being overly simplistic. Animals are a huge one. Both references to animals and specific animals show up throughout all of Kafka's works. There's a story where the main character is a dog, a story where the main character is a baboon, a mouse, some sort of insect, probably a cockroach, but not necessarily, an indeterminate giant rodent that is paranoid and lives underground, and there's... I already said a mouse, didn't I? Okay. Sorry? Yes, jackals. But that's not quite the main story, the main character. There's a story called Jackals and Arabs, where one of the characters is split into three groups. The Arabs, the jackals, and the European. It's a fairly interesting story. So animals is a thread that I could have chosen, but law and work really do seem to be the two most pervasive ones. And I could really talk about either one, but I'm going to focus on law. Work shows up in interesting ways, and in fact, at the end of my talk, I'm going to, disjointly from everything else, reference a story that you should all read and maybe quote a line from it, that is one of the most interesting portrayals of what a job looks like that I've ever read. But law is the one that I've read more about. Law is the one that occurs to me most when I'm reading Kafka. So, some words about law. Kafka sees law everywhere. In Kafka's works, law is often just a stand-in for